This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Isn't it amazing how the face of an old friend can seem so familiar, even if you haven't seen them for years or even decades? On the other hand, the names of some of your old classmates may have been forgotten. Have you ever wondered what's going on in here to support these successes or failures of learning and memory? Well, this is the subject of the research in my laboratory. We're trying to understand exactly what changes in your brain when you learn and how those changes persist over time to support memory. And one thing that we know, which helps to explain why some things are easier to remember than others, is that learning is not a unitary process. There's no single mechanism of learning in the brain, but instead there are distinct kinds of learning that depend on distinct brain regions. A brain structure called the hippocampus supports memory for facts and events in your life. This is what you rely on to remember someone's name or what you had for breakfast. Whereas another structure called the amygdala supports emotional memory. You can have a fear of dogs even if you've lost the explicit hippocampus-dependent memory of having been bitten by one as a child. So these memory systems are fairly independent. The basal ganglia supports habit memory. This is what you're using when you brush your teeth or drive to work while your mind is elsewhere. The cerebral cortex supports perceptual learning. Even basic functions like being able to see depend critically on experience and learning. And this structure down here is called the cerebellum. It supports motor learning. This is the process by which you acquire skilled movements. If we were to zoom in on any one of these brain areas, we find that they are made up of the same basic building blocks. Neurons, which are specialized cells of the nervous system, and synapses, which are the connections between neurons that allow one to signal to the next. But unlike wires, synapses are not static, but can change with experience. The electrical and chemical signals that flow through your synapses as they process information can induce long-lasting changes. So on the one hand, we know a lot about how learning and memory are organized at the functional whole brain level. On the other hand, we know a lot about its implementation at the cellular level of individual neurons and synapses. The next great challenge, and the one my lab is tackling, is to try to bridge the gap between these very different levels of organization and understand how learning works at the level of the neural circuit. Because it's the circuit level organization that causes changes in the synapses of your hippocampus to be able to encode the name of someone, whereas changes in the synapses of your cerebellum improve your tennis game. A lot of the magic occurs at this intermediate circuit level of organization. And of course, that's true not just of brains, but for many things, it's that intermediate level of organization that's really critical to how the thing works, right? So if, for example, you wanted to understand how a car works so you could fix it, you might go down to your auto parts store and carefully examine spark plugs and belts and gaskets and hoses and things like that. And you might also draw on your experience as a driver to know that there is a power system that makes the car go, and a steering system that makes it turn, and a braking system. But that's not enough, right? If you want to fix your car, the critical thing is to understand how all of those parts interact to give rise to the engine that makes the car go, and how all the parts fit together to make the steering system that makes it turn. It's this critical intermediate level of organization that's necessary if you want to fix your car. And of course, for the car, we have things like engineering drawings and auto mechanics repair manuals that give us that information about how the parts work together. But we have no such thing for the brain. And so that's what my lab is working to produce, because that's what we need if we want to be able to fix it. And of course, we do want to fix it. 1 in 20 kids has a learning disability. 1 in 7 people over the age of 70, and half of the people over 85 have either Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. And the treatments available at this point are not as effective as we'd like. They're mainly pharmaceutical. And for most drugs, we have some idea how they act at the level of individual neurons or synapses. But we don't know much about how the effects at that level then influence the next level up, the neural circuit and its ability to process and store information. And so sometimes the drugs work and sometimes they don't, and often we don't really understand why. Some very new, exciting technologies are being developed that will allow us to manipulate the brain with a precision that's not possible with drugs. But even if tomorrow someone were to hand doctors a magic new technology that would enable them to control neurons and synapses with whatever precision they want, safely, inexpensively, those doctors would still not be able to improve the school performance of the kids with learning disabilities. And they would still not be able to prevent cognitive impairment and loss of memory in older adults. Because at this point, we don't really understand enough about learning to know which neurons and synapses within a circuit would need to be tinkered with. So at this point, giving doctors this magic tool would be a lot like giving me some fancy wrenches, but no repair manual, and asking me to fix your car. I could go in there, and I could make some changes, and I might get lucky. But if it was my car or my brain, I'd want to have the detailed repair manual available. So that's what my lab is working to produce. We're trying to understand how neurons and synapses work together in circuits to support learning and memory. So what do we know about neural circuits? Well, the function of a circuit is to compute, to take an input and generate an output. And this transformation of input into output is accomplished and shaped by the very precise patterns of interconnections, synaptic connections between neurons and your neural circuits. And this is really how information is processed in the brain. Information is processed and transformed and used to make decisions through the many individual synaptic signaling events that occur in a neural circuit. So for example, you're driving down the road and you see a yellow light. That input will activate neurons in your the visual parts of your brain. And when they're activated, they'll send signals to the neurons on which they make synapses. A typical neuron has connections with thousands of other neurons. If some of those neurons get enough input, they will then become activated and signal to the next neurons, which will signal to the next neurons, until eventually an output is generated, a movement of your foot to the accelerator. A lot of you are nodding, but a few of you are frowning disapprovingly at the rest of us, right? But to those of you frowning, never fear, because the synapses that define our neural circuits, as I said, are not static, but can change with experience. So, for example, if you get a ticket for running a red light, this is likely to induce changes in your brain. Some synapses might get stronger, others could get weaker, and this will cause that circuit to process information differently the next time it's activated. So the next time you see that yellow light, the output of your circuits could be quite different. You might move your foot to the brake. This is just one simple example of the kind of computation your brain is performing all the time, every day. And we think that virtually all of the computations the brain performs are powerfully influenced by experience and learning. My lab focuses on the effects of learning on the computations performed by this brain region, the cerebellum. And the cerebellum has some cognitive functions. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it plays a key role in motor learning, the process by which movements become smooth and accurate with practice. And you might think first of musicians and athletes and dancers, but if you've ever observed a small child, then you probably realize that most movements are learned. Even mundane acts like walking or reaching accurately for something without knocking it over are gradually learned through a lot of repetition and practice. And even once we acquire those skillful movements, the circuits that produce those movements need to be continually recalibrated as the body changes. As it grows and then ages, we need to make those recalibrations or our movements would again become clumsy like those of a child. And this is in fact what's seen in patients with damage to this brain area. So the cerebellum has some important functions, but the main reason my lab focuses on this structure, it's the brain region where we have the very best chance of understanding how learning works at the level of the circuit. Why is that? Well, one of the very first things you need if you want to analyze a circuit is the wiring diagram. We need to know which neurons are connected to which and how signals flow through the pathways, through the circuit. And for most learning tasks, we don't have that. But we do have it for several learning tasks that depend on the cerebellum. And the heart of that is shown here. So now, with this wiring diagram in hand, we're able to go on and ask the next level of questions about how the circuit computes and how learning affects that computation. And my lab is asking three very fundamental questions about this process. The first is, where in the circuit do changes occur when you learn? If you go out and practice your golf swing this weekend, which synapses in your cerebellum will get strengthened and which will get weakened? Will it be the connections from the green neuron to the red or from the green to the purple? Are particular kinds of synapses more likely to undergo changes than other? And are the changes all happening at one stage in the signal processing pathway, or are there multiple serial changes? These are the kinds of issues that we're looking at. A second very fundamental question is, how are changes induced in the circuit? Which neurons in your cerebellum are monitoring the accuracy of your swing and deciding when the circuit that produces that movement needs to be updated? Which neurons know when you made a mistake? And the third fundamental question is, how are synaptic changes in the circuit read out? How do particular changes in the circuit alter the way that it processes information the next time that it's activated? And we don't have all the answers to these questions, but what we've found so far by studying the cerebellum parallels in many ways what's been seen at the whole brain level. We know that there are distinct kinds of learning and memory that depend on distinct brain regions. But until very recently, it was thought that within a brain region, there was one main learning mechanism, so that every time that brain region learned, it did it in very much the same way. In contrast, what we found is that the cerebellum contains within it multiple learning mechanisms. So if your golf swing needs a particular kind of adjustment, you may be able to accomplish that through different combinations of changes in the circuits of your cerebellum. We find that individual training sessions can engage more than one learning mechanism, and fairly subtle changes in the way we do the training or the way you practice can determine which mechanisms are recruited or not recruited, which synapses change or don't change. And this has some really important implications, because we think that the recruitment of different learning mechanisms will affect factors like how long the learning is retained, whether what you learn in one context will generalize to other contexts. And we think it'll affect the ability of learning to be reversed if circumstances change. And of course, these things are important not just for your golf swing, but for other things like developing rehabilitation strategies for patients who have had a stroke, and developing education strategies for our kids. But of course, along the way, if we do learn something that could improve your golf swing, well, I think that would be okay too. Thank you for your time.